in here and help me welcome Betsy and Scott.
Okay, I have got to take a picture of this because I'm so excited to send it to my publisher. He's going to be so excited to see it. Yay. Thank you so much for coming. Yes, wave. Thank you guys. Okay, I will stop being a nerd. Well, no, I kind of won't. But... Hi, Scott.
Hi, Betsy. Well, I'm excited to be here, and I'm really impressed at the size of this crowd, especially since there's so much other stuff going on tonight. Makes me proud of our town that we have this much stuff going on. It makes me proud that so many of you made the effort to come here when you had other options. And I think that says a lot about you.
And you.
No, it's all you, girl. It's all you. Anyway, I really enjoyed this book. For what it's worth, in the upcoming winter edition of Montana Quarterly, this was the editor's pick, which it means it's the best book I read in the last 3 months.
Thank you. Really, I'm so grateful.
But I read a lot of books. I read a lot of books, and this is by far the best that I've read in the last quarter. So, your first book was about Cliven Bundy, that lovable bundle of kisses out of Las Vegas. And that opened a lot of eyes, but I'm wondering, where did this book come from? What was the source?
Yeah, okay, so that's an interesting question because it came from, the origins of this book were very different from what it became. I think that American Zion, the Bundy book, came out in 2020, and it was a version of my dissertation. So it was looking at cowboy mythology and early Mormon church theology and how that really informed the Bundy's war. And for those of you who don't know who Cliven Bundy and his family are, they are a group of LDS ranchers in southern Nevada who were involved in two land use, or I should say, like armed events over various kind of public land issues. One in Nevada, where they had an armed standoff in 2014 over Cliven Bundy illegally grazing cows. His permit had been canceled and he continued to graze for 20 years. And 2 years later, his sons took over the Malheur Wildlife Refuge in Oregon. And there are reasons that the Malheur takeover happened. They're somewhat confusing, but anyway, they took over this refuge in order to sort of advocate for a family, the Hammond family, who had been involved in arson on public lands. And then they later said, mining, logging, and ranching needs to happen in this Oregon wildlife refuge. And so this book came out, and COVID happened, and I wasn't able to do anything with this book. And I started thinking about anti-science. That really was the motivation. I want to write a book on why America is uniquely anti-science, why half of Americans don't believe in evolution. And you see in the first chapter, I visit a creation museum in Glendive, Montana. But that was too reductive. That was too small. I needed to talk about, in writing this book, or wanted to, about what we were going through at the moment of pandemic and incredible polarization. This was when Trump was really benefiting from Americans being at odds with each other. And I started to look at how the West in particular defined what it meant to be an American. I really felt like the West was kind of the key to understanding what was happening in terms of, this kind of rugged individualism, this American exceptionalism, things that Americans were sort of conflating with COVID, like somehow we didn't need to be vaccinated or we would be impervious to disease. But then I looked at all the myths that were informing people about what the West was and why so many people were moving here. The West as healthy and hale, like a salubrious place. Let's go west so we can be in the mountains and we won't have to worry about COVID. And all of a sudden, our local clinics were being swamped. Let's go west and live the, sort of life of whatever Dutton, Kevin Costner, Yellowstone. Let's buy places.
You mean that's not true?
Yeah. Well, that is true. But all these myths. I mean, the Yellowstone was getting, especially in Bozeman, getting people to buy places sight unseen. And then West is homeland. West is front line, and the American redoubt. And all these people who were moving here to await a second coming or a civil war. So I just saw how all these things were layered on each other, and it became even more obvious during COVID. So I went from being anti-science to being kind of examining what was happening in the West and how that was reflective of what was happening to us as a country.
Well, the subtitle is Myth and Mending on the Far Side of America. I guess the far side depends on which direction you're looking at it from, but I really respect your analysis of the myths that drive the West, and those are things that I've thought about for a long time. People have been coming here for a long time thinking it's Shangri-La, just over the pass, and that's very rarely worked out for anybody. But now it's changing. It's a different sort of myth, and the concept of myth I find very interesting. What's the difference between a myth and a lie?
Okay, that is something that I really tried to kind of come to terms with. Humans are a species that are myth makers. We live among myths. We are always going to live among myths. And I think it's incumbent upon us to understand our myths and to sort of unpack them. To unpack the cowboy myth, to unpack manifest destiny, to unpack the American dream. That's okay to have, these foundational myths if we understand them. Lies are just lies. Lies are misinformation. And I really tried to see how misinformation piled on mythology and what that meant. In one case, I interviewed a woman in Glendive, Montana, who had come west from Maine. She had decided to move to her in-laws' farm, and she was really sort of motivated by the agricultural dream, like this agrarian, Edenic West. We know that the West is not Edenic. We know that there's no such thing as rains follows the plow. We know that there were homesteaders who were unsuccessful because they were trying to do things in terms of, agricultural progress that were absolutely impossible in the West. But what she also brought was this idea of QAnon. She was very motivated by these conspiracy theories that involve child trafficking, that involve pedophilia, that involve Democrats bathing in the blood of children, and so she brought these things to the West, although they were here already, motivated by mythologies, but also indoctrinated by conspiracy theory and misinformation, and that's really what I was trying to navigate.
Do you think our reliance on myths makes us more susceptible to outright lies?
Oh my gosh, Scott.
Sorry, I said I'd do something.
I know, I thought you were said you would be nice. I don't know. I mean, I actually have, I will tell you, when I started this book, I was incredibly angry. And, I think I was coming into it seeing the awful things that happen on social media, the way people were treating each other, the people who were benefiting from polarization, the fact that politicians were acquiring power by us hating each other. There was something in sort of cultivating hate that was so disheartening for me, and I came out of this feeling so much better. I mean, in creating relationships, and as you said, this is myth and mending. And so, yes, we are a myth-making species, but I also feel like we're a species that likes to be in relationship with each other. I also know that we're a species that also it can be awful to each other, and we can dehumanize each other. And that's really what was scaring me. After studying the Bundys and looking at how the militia movement and the patriot movement was sort of benefiting from othering people, dehumanizing people, Democrats versus Republicans, or whatever the dichotomy. I also feel like we are a species that likes to be in relationship with each other. We like to understand each other. And I came out of it having hope in a way that I don't think I had when I went into it. Yes, we are a myth-making species, and we are susceptible to misinformation, but there's a way to engage with one another where I truly think that a shared story, a common ground can be reached, and that we can get around people who are trying to manipulate us. I mean, truly manipulate us. Like, some of this stuff is so manufactured so that we are at odds with each other. And as I said, I think people are benefiting from that.
Gee, there's fibs on the internet? On talk radio?
Yeah, I found a couple.
Yeah, I was talking to a mutual friend of ours last night about this event tonight, and she's been involved in Montana politics and public policy for many years, and she said, for all my life, I've been able to talk to people on the other side of the aisle, and it wasn't a problem. But lately, it's become a problem. And I think it became a problem before COVID. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? COVID, the Trump era.
Yeah.
As you said, people use those resentments and those stresses for their own benefits and aims. But I mean, are we just getting more unpleasant of it?
Yeah, no, I think that we are. And I also think that there's opportunity. I met a man who couldn't have been more politically different than me, who said, if I'd never met you, I would have been afraid of you. And so I think we have become so siloed because of COVID, because of the way we get our information, and we've fallen out of practice of talking to each other. And I was able to talk to people. I was able to talk to the Bundys. Now, I'm not saying that that's something that should necessarily happen, because I mean,
you think they'd let me in?
No, I think that there are. I think that we need to understand who still can be open-minded and still have an ability to engage in conversation rather than having an ideology that that's it and we're getting our guns. But one of the things that really scared me, Scott, and this is something that I talked to a number of people about, is there have been conversations about civil war, and I've been asked about this over and over again. I'm not sure how that would work geographically, but I do think that there are people, like Josh Hawley or Marjorie Taylor Greene, who want people from red people in blue states to move to red states, and so that we have red states and blue states, and we are so at odds, and these people continue to stay in power. And I found that because people were getting versions of me, a liberal, from really ugly, whether it was, AM radio or whether it was, Fox News or Tucker Carlson or some of these very hateful social media, sort of places that they didn't understand me as a human. And I know that sounds really sort of extreme and weird, but that's what is happening. That we're forgetting that we're neighbors. And I found that I do have huge concerns about national politics, but in communities, there's still opportunity to be in relationship with each other and to work out things that matter across the board.
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, here in Livingston, I was next door at the Elks one night a couple of years ago having a drink, and I saw two long-term subscribers of the magazine, and they're both long-term Republicans. They're not MAGA guys, but they're conservative Republicans, and they were talking about me in front of me, and one of them said, "Yeah, he runs a hell of a magazine, but he's an asshole." And the other one said, "Yeah, he's an asshole." And I realized they meant a Democrat. But we're still friends. That's okay. I mean, we can disagree, and I would surely hope that we can, get back to that point where we can disagree with each other and still support each other, pull each other out of the ditch.
Yeah.
When it's necessary. One thing, I mean, you bust a lot of myths in this, and one is the I don't remember what you called it, but you used the Yellowstone Club as an example to illustrate it, how people are destroying what they came here to find.
Yeah.
What the sucker that attracted it to this place. And then I was going through the blurbs there, and Hampton Sides, who's a writer I very much respect, gave you a very nice blurb, and he described you as a wry and wise observer. And I thought, well, yeah, he's got that, because when you talked about the Yellowstone Club, you said, yeah, these are people who poop in the river. I mean, this is happening all over the state, all over the West. People really coming in disregard, not just for local communities, but for the natural attractions that bring them here. I mean, Blixeth used to advertise the Yellowstone Club as own your own slice of Yellowstone. But anyway, what were your experiences in those ultra-exclusive communities that you explored?
Well, first of all, I want to tell you that I relied so much on the work that you did on Tim Blixeth and the Yellowstone Club. I mean, you've written about it for the Bozeman Chronicle. That was a place where I got a great deal of my information, so thank you for that. I went to the Yellowstone Club, I think, for the first time when I was working for American Wildlands, and I think that would have been in 1997, or around there, maybe a little bit later. And I saw what they were doing. And the myth that I talk about is this idea of a wilderness sanctuary or a wilderness retreat, that wealthy people are drawn to wilderness, and yet they are destroying wilderness. I mean, they're building in elk migratory corridors. They're putting pressure on grizzly bears. They're contributing to roadkill, and so I think that these folks who have an idea that they're going to get a little slice of Yellowstone and build a wilderness sanctuary, they're building a gilded wilderness. I mean, it doesn't, what they want doesn't exist. And what they're doing is encroaching on these areas that are so important for habitat. And they're also creating enormous inequity in communities that cater to them, but people can no longer to afford to live there. And so the Yellowstone Club is such a, I mean, it's heartbreaking. And, you know, they're also, as you said, I mean, they're putting enormous pressure on the Gallatin River. And the sanitation issues, that they're not solving it. And we're seeing these algae blooms that are really scary, and they're now trying to manage how they're going to move forward with, you know, water quality. And people want to believe that they're moving to these wilderness retreats, and they're polluting, and they're developing, and they're causing cultural problems. And not only that, and I talk a lot about this in the book, they're seasonal people, so they're not committed to a community.
Well, it's a slice of wilderness with a heated driveway. We're going to see here in Park County, they just bought a huge chunk of the Crazy Mountains. They're making nice noises. We'll see what they do. I think the people that are representing Yellowstone Club up there, they seem sincere in saying they're going to be good neighbors, but who knows? They could be fired. It's owned by a hedge fund, which exists for one reason, and that's to make more money, to maximize returns. So it's kind of hard to be optimistic about having them on this side of the task. But Betsy, you talk so much about myths and the impact that they have on the West. The myth of the West, movies, TV, books, you know, going back to Shane and dime novels.
Hopalong Cassidy.
Yeah.
John Wayne.
Yeah. Mary and Michael Morrison. And the impacts that these are having as our country becomes more affluent and more mobile. But I'm wondering, I mean, did you look outside the country? Are Americans, everybody has their mythology. When I lived in Korea, I had people look at me with a straight face and tell me Korea was the only country in the world that had 4 seasons. So everybody's got their myths, but do you think this happens in other countries where it's nation shaping, the force of mythology, or are we just more gullible?
No. I think it happens in, I mean, one of the places that I spend a good deal of time in, and Lynn Donaldson is here tonight, I worked with Dan McMillion, and Genghis Khan is absolutely foundational. Now, he's not a mythological person, but he's been dead for a while. And yet, you know, the idea of Genghis Khan, or Chinggis Khan, as you would say in Mongolia, looms so large. And I don't think, I mean, as I said, humans are myth makers, so it's not something that's uniquely American. But what I would say is uniquely American is the West is foundational to what it means to be an American, whether people realize that or not.
Well, yeah, I think I have to agree that the concept of frontier,
Yep.
which is throughout our history, frontier has been something that we conquered, and we talk about the space frontier and underseas frontiers. And I think we're running out of things to conquer.
Which is something that's really important to Americans, this unending frontier. And we're now bumping against the reality of running out of water in places in the West. The fact that we're on the front lines of climate change, drought, fire. These are things that and then endless resources. I think that was really motivating too in terms of Manifest Destiny. These endless resources. Well, they weren't endless. I mean, we barely were able to protect beaver, bison, and now we're again. I mean, we've seen boom and bust and boom and bust. And our timber industry, our mining industries are sort of victims of economics. Ranching is hard, really hard. So, these myths that were so motivating, you do bump against reality.
Reality's hard.
Profound.
One last question, and then we'll open it up. I know you folks are going to have questions. One thing that I wonder about is, I grew up here in Park County, 4 generations. I've seen a lot of changes, some good, some not so good. And one thing that I wonder about is who is having the biggest impact on our state and its natural ambience as a class. Is it the rich? Is it the poor? Is it the middle class? I mean, who has the biggest footprint? Not to put you on the spot, right?
Yeah. Thanks, Scott. I'm not sure. I don't know if I can answer that. I think everybody has an impact. I mean, my own myth that I pursued in moving out west now 31 years ago was the myth of wilderness. And this idea of, John Muir, untrammeled public lands. And as we know, they weren't untrammeled, they're native lands. And so I was lured by my own myth. And so I think that it's really important to think about, the people who say there are people who can work remotely now, and they're coming into places like Bozeman and Livingston, and they are making it impossible for people who live here to buy properties. They might not be very wealthy, but they're more wealthy than people who live here. And so they're putting pressure on people who want to stay in Bozeman and Livingston, but can no longer afford to do so. And then I think of my friend Chris Latre, who, by the way, is one of the most hilarious, amazing. If you don't subscribe to his newsletter, please do. The Irritable Métis, which is so funny. And so when people were talking about, lamenting the fact that it was becoming impossible to buy places during COVID because people were buying places unseen, he said, I feel really bad for you, but welcome to the last 500 years, mofos. which I think is, and so that's, and so we have that, and then we have wealthy people coming and creating these places in really fragile, vulnerable wildlands. That's putting enormous pressure on us. I'm not sure I would blame any one group. I actually, as a conservationist for years and years and years, look back at how we approached resource extraction and how we wanted to protect public land, and we didn't give real consideration to how people were going to put food on the table. We wanted them to stop mining, logging, and grazing, and I still feel strongly about that. But one of the reasons why so many of our rural communities in the West have become red is because we did not give enough thought to what they were going to do to raise their families and provide food and have jobs. And I think that, again, I feel like, and I say this is a quote in my book. I'm talking to Candy DeGraw, who is a LDS. She grew up LDS. She now lives in Escalante. She works for the Forest Service. She's upset that so many conservationists come into her community and are super condescending. And, and then there's the Mormon people who live there who hate conservationists and want to go back to these extractive practices without any regulations. And she says, I think everybody is a little wrong. And I think that's really important to think about. And that's what I sort of challenge people in this book. it's asking people to be self-reflective.
Well, I think that we probably could have avoided a lot of these intense debates that we have in Montana around the West if we'd just taken a little time to talk to each other over the years. I don't think it's too late. I think we can talk to each other. My Republican friends who call me asshole because of who I vote for, I'll still pull them out of the ditch. They do the same for me. But Betsy, thank you. I mean, this is a book-length examination of how we got here and what we can do to be better. So I'm sure people have questions. I'm done. Yes, Lil.
Little?
Oh, I'm sorry. I got my Mary Ann, I got my glasses on now.
Wow, Scott.
There she is.
So Scott, he has some tough questions there.
Yeah, he said he wasn't going to, and then look what he did.
And he's like, whenever I've written for me, he goes, so what? So you kind of got that. But, this is a bit of a softball, but it's what I'd really like to hear an example of one of those conversations that gave you hope. And is it scalable in any way to have that sort of experience?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts on that. I did have some really great conversations with people that thought I had enormously different positions than I do. But it also got me thinking about what we could do. And one of the things that I considered, and I thought this was so fun, there's a woman, her name is Angelina, she's a really good friend of mine, and she was the head of the Montana Human Rights Network. For a while, she was there for 2 years. She's since moved to Albuquerque. She grew up in New Mexico, and she was working for the Montana Human Rights Network when we were seeing the awful things happening at the Montana State Legislature, the Zoe Zephyr debacle and any number of other things that we were watching. And she said a couple of things to me that really that I'd really like to consider as we move forward in doing, engaging in conversations and being more involved with rural communities, because I think that rural communities are particularly vulnerable to radicalization. And that's where I was coming from when I started this book, looking at the influence of the Bundys. And, when I first met the Bundys, I thought they were outliers. And Todd Wilkinson said, we've seen the Bundification of the West, and I came to see it as the Bundification of America. Because I saw what Stuart Rhodes, who had been involved in the Bundy activities, and he's now in prison for 18 years as being a central architect for the January 6th insurrection, and I write about that in this book. He lived in Montana. But Angelina said two things to me, or we talked about the idea of what if college students didn't go abroad, but they went to Europe, but they spent a semester in rural communities, and how that kind of engagement, because the VISTA program does some really amazing jobs, and one of the people that I talked to in Terry, Montana, who I absolutely ended up adoring, had worked with VISTA volunteers, and he was a conservative Republican, but I really feel like he, fifth generation rancher, hadn't really done much with B and Terry, Montana. Because of the VISTA volunteers that he talked to, he was more open. And I feel like if there were exchange programs between colleges, kids going to these rural communities, because there is such a disconnect right now between rural communities and urban communities. And the other thing she said, which goes to what Scott was saying earlier, which I thought was so funny. She said, my family, most of them are conservative. She has Hispanic, Indigenous, and white, being from New Mexico. She has members of her family and that are from these various groups. And she said, if I broke down in Boise, Montana, I could call one of my uncles. They would drive through the night. They would fix my car, and I'd be on my way. If I called somebody in Bozeman to help me, they'd send me their Venmo address. And I thought that was so funny. And you know what? Kind of true. So So anyway, that's sort of an answer to your question. Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question, and thank you for being here. I'm curious about whether, in the course of reporting this book and talking
I'm
to
sorry,
various
could you
people,
speak up a little, please?
yeah, I'm curious about whether, in the course of reporting this book and talking to various people, you changed your mind about certain ideas or assumptions that you had or what you had expected to find.
Yeah, thank you for that. And for those who couldn't hear, how did I change in terms of my perspectives? And I will tell you a couple things. Number one, as I said, I started this book feeling enormously angry, and I finished feeling like there were ways forward. Now, we're going to have pressure put on us for the next year during this campaign, and we are going to be told to hate each other and to fear each other, and we're going to see a lot of people trying to rip us apart. But I really felt like in relationship building and in dialogue, we still want to be together. In communities, community members want to be in relationship with each other. And I'm seeing really exciting sort of examples of this. Idaho is one of the most conservative states in the country, and they've been targeted by extremists. And it's an intentional campaign that I write about called the American Redoubt. And it's part of a number of different campaigns that have really targeted Idaho to be this place of the militia movement, the patriot movement, this Christian nationalist movement. And there are a lot of Idaho conservatives that are saying, no, we are conservative, but we do not want extremists. And they've done it before because that was where Aryan Nations was. Richard Butler, it has a history of people seeing Idaho as homeland. But we're seeing now conservative Republicans in Idaho really fighting back against extremists. And so I didn't expect that. I didn't expect to see that because I was seeing like, oh my God, Trump is just dripping into everything. Well, there are places where people are fighting back. And the other thing that I think that I realized is I'm somebody who, I love people. I mean, I just do. And I think that I finished this book feeling so much, I'd gotten really mad, and I felt so much more empathetic. And again, I want to say, there are bad guys. There are bad guys. And, not everybody deserves a conversation or deserves empathy. But there are so many people who have different political differences that still can find common ground. And I think I know, and I hear, this common friend, whoever she may be, I understand her frustration. But I really do think we can't give up on it. And Chris Latre writes about it too. He has this wonderful example of a neighbor who he worked with. His neighbor had Trump signs everywhere, and he felt kind of crabby about it. And then there was another neighbor who had that they couldn't pay their electric bill, and they didn't have electricity. So the Trump neighbor and Chris Latre took a long extension cord and got this woman electricity, and were able to take care of her. And he said, we did it together.
Yeah. I mean, it's still out there. We just need to embrace that, I think. Questions?
I have a comment or question. I'm just wondering what your
Can't
opinion
quite
would
hear
be.
you.
Oh, I'm just wondering what your opinion would be on people not necessarily being educated nowadays, and they're being coerced into Trump philosophy, and like bullying is okay, and I'm not being held responsible for my actions. And then twofold, and that's why they look at liberals, and I don't like that word, I'll be honest. You're Democrats, you're for socialization, you're for helping your fellow human being. You don't necessarily need to be a liberal to do that. But I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the lack of education nowadays. And people are being dumb and they're not getting the proper information that they need to know about to choose their elective officials correctly.
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem. And there are people who want to gut education budgets. And there are people who are, screaming about critical race theory because they don't want to teach history. It's a thing. And, the only thing I can say is invest in your community, get involved with your school board, insist that kids get the kind of education that they need, because there are people who are very much interested in targeting education to keep people ignorant. And it behooves a certain group of people. And one of these examples that I was looking at in Idaho, there was a school board that was targeted by extremists, and 2 of them won by something like 7 votes. And they demanded a recount. And they were able to get these people out of it. Again, Bonners Ferry, one of the most conservative towns in Idaho. Now, the problem is, November 7th came up, they weren't paying attention anymore, and these guys won again. So I would say, get involved in your community and be vigilant. Because they're going to fight back again, and Idaho actually, this most recent election, they were able to kick out a lot of extremists. And I don't know if you know about Moms for Liberty, but these are the people who are really targeting taking over school districts and trying to dumb down everything. And it goes to this community level of involvement and vigilance. So, and I think your question's great, because it is a thing.
Not just school boards, but library boards and irrigation districts, and there's a nationwide movement to go from the ground up to get people in there. So it's important to be involved in those races and pay attention to those issues.
I'm wondering if maybe I can read in this, but
Please,
to read a passage, and then I'm happy to answer questions and sign books and hang out. And after I get done with this really grueling, brutal interview with this guy.
You're tougher than a Hunter-eyed chicken, girl. You're going to be just fine.
Okay, so this kind of sums up what my book is about. One of the things that I talk about are land acknowledgements. I spend time talking to a number of Native friends about ways of looking at land. I look at Judeo-Christian concepts of dominion, these kind of mythologies, subduing land. I talk about the idea of a land acknowledgement. There's some Native people who really love it. There's some who think it's just white people Googling something 5 minutes before they have to do it. So there's some real opinions on that. And so I talked to my friend Francine Spang-Willis, who is Northern Cheyenne, and she really is, she very much loves land acknowledgements. And so I have this chapter where I'm talking about all these various things, and this is not meant to replace a land acknowledgement, but this is me kind of thinking about, instead of Googling something, like, what does this place mean to me? The West is more than a playground or a storage site awaiting resource extraction. It is more than a second home or a selfie. It is a land of many cultures. It's a place of countless generations. A place where dancers in jingle dresses move to drums, thrilling powwow attendees. A place where rock walls hold messages drawn long ago. It's a land where wolves still den and nurture pups despite vicious eradication programs. Where people run under high canyon walls and children swim in frigid snowmelt. Men have died in mines here under cruel conditions. Militias have gathered while book clubs have read. This is a place where horses gallop, bears binge in their time of hyperphagia, and ponderosa pines topple in drought-desiccated soils. Glowing neon signs beckon from rain-soaked windows, and pronghorns tangle and die in barbed wire. Here are introduced condors that nest in the cracks of desert rock walls and human families who struggle to secure homes. It's snow chains on passes, businesses closed for the season, and lariat loops that wildly fly towards the rear legs of racing cabs. It's mile markers, mountain lions, and slag heaps. A rifle shot felling a 12-point elk, an AM radio blaring preachers and conservative rabble-rousers. It's a place of innumerable footprints of humans and beasts, stamped in dust, mud, and snow, where people live out on the landscape and need what that landscape offers. We must concede history. We must recognize forebearers. We must honor the place as interconnected and whole, not chopped into rectangular parcels by arbitrary boundaries or gutted for commodities. Actions without consequence, human dominion, inexhaustible abundance, and dualism, the idea that we are separate from nature, are myths bearing down on us. These must first be acknowledged before we begin to consider a better story for this place.
Thank you, Betsy. As a very smart Republican once told me, that the mind cannot endure more. The mind cannot absorb more than the hind end can endure. So, with that, we'll put Betsy on her hind end, and she'll talk to people and sign books. And thank you, everybody, for coming.